You hear a lot today about fan entitlement. It's a term I hear thrown around quite a bit, particularly by those who disagree with a very popular fan movement or opinion that happens to be negative. Look at these fans. They think they're entitled to that show or film franchise to do whatever they want. So, out of curiosity, I explored more on what is meant by fan entitlement, only to come to the conclusion that it's much like the Easter Bunny or a leprechaun. It's a myth. It doesn't exist. Further, it does appear to me that those who push the notion of fan entitlement seem to actually be promoting studio entitlement, the idea that studios are entitled for fans to shut up and love everything they put out, which they are not. Because many of the examples that are often given as examples of fan entitlement, I would classify as fans expressing their opinions on said work, which they have every right to do, and as loudly as they want to do it. There are some examples of fan entitlement that I would just classify differently as toxic fandom, which does very much exist, but it's different than fan entitlement, which I believe does not exist. So this is the myth of fan entitlement and why it's dangerous. What is meant by fan entitlement? So after hearing this term, I sought out a lot of YouTube videos and articles that discuss this topic to try to learn what fan entitlement is. I found this one definition on Urban Dictionary. A common ailment of fanboys and fangirls, such individuals believe that because they watch a program, buy a product, or attend a show, that they are on the same level as the person or people who worked on the entertainment that they enjoy. Whenever things don't turn out how they think it should be, they bitch, they whine, and complain. Now, this isn't exactly how everyone I came across were defining fan entitlement, but it does seem to be indicative of the general idea. But to be fair, many of the video essays I came across acknowledged that fans had a right to their opinions and they had the right to feel disappointed if something they love went in a direction that they didn't like, and further, that they had a right to express said opinions. Fan entitlement, they argued, went beyond simply expressing one's disappointment with a story that they were consuming and entered the territory of feeling like they had entitlement to dictate the path the story should take, and that the creators should be beholden to their wishes as fans and not what the creators deems is best for the story. So, I'd like to explore that idea of how fans demonstrate that they are entitled to ownership of a media piece that they are exploring. However, before I do that, I feel I need to discuss another way I saw the term fan entitlement being described, which I personally feel didn't really fall under the banner of fan entitlement and more closely fits another term that I've heard thrown around, and that is toxic fandom. Toxic fandom. Now, this is at all subjective. However, I personally find a distinction between toxic fandom and fan entitlement, as when I did my research on what people considered fan entitlement, I saw a lot of examples given that I would deem toxic fandom rather than fan entitlement. Now, what is toxic fandom is also subjective, as some may consider someone who tweets at Ryan Johnson, "Hey, you suck, thanks for ruining my childhood, asshole," toxic fandom, but others may not. Some may consider someone who posts 100 YouTube videos stating over and over again that Disney ruined Star Wars toxic fandom and others may not. And some may, for just a random crazy example, may consider an hour-and-a-half long video complaining that the finale of Star Trek Voyager is the worst series finale in television history, made by a greedy corporate executive without a creative bone in his body because he read a spreadsheet on what he believed would make money. Toxic fandom, and others may not. So, it can be quite subjective. However, what are, in my opinion, clear signs of toxic fandom is whenever the term death threat is used, or when actors and other creatives are harassed so much they need to cancel their Twitter account or other social media account. Or, for example, if fans try to ruin an actor's relationship with their partner because they'd rather see that actor be with their co-star instead. To me, these are clear-cut examples of toxic fandom, and I've seen some of these examples used to describe fan entitlement. Now, I know many may make the argument that they could be both. And again, this is very subjective and just my opinion, but I wouldn't ascribe the word entitlement to describe such behavior, because I feel whether or not the toxic fan in this circumstance feels entitled is beside the point. Some may feel entitled, others may not, but that's not the issue. The issue is the toxicity they are spewing towards real-life people just because they are unhappy with how their favorite film, television, or other franchise turned out. To me, someone who sends death threats to an actor who performed in a movie they don't like isn't displaying entitlement. They're displaying the fact that they are not a decent human being. Entitlement is beside the point. The toxic fan also includes those who use racism or sexism to attack film franchises or piece of fiction. These, in my opinion, definitely don't apply to fan entitlement. It just applies to them being racist, sexist, or otherwise bigoted. What they're being racist or sexist about is less important than the bigotry itself. And similar to that topic, anyone who uses the word woke to attack a piece of fiction, I believe shouldn't be listened to by anyone. Whenever the word is used to attack something, that's a clear-cut sign that whatever they have to say is valueless. And it tends to come from the viewpoint that all pieces of fiction, especially the films or shows that they love, should always have a main character and center around a cast that is mostly made up of white, heterosexual, cis males. Just as God intended, because that's the standard, that's the norm, and to do otherwise must mean that you're woke. That definitely falls under the banner of toxicity, and I have no time for it. So, in my opinion, toxic fandom is not the same as fan entitlement, and thus I would dismiss examples of people sending actors death threats or chasing them off social media platforms with racist rants as not being examples of fan entitlement. So to get back to exploring the topic of fan entitlement and why the term is used, I would like next to explore the other extreme of fandom. The other extreme of fandom. Now, of course, fandom isn't a simple binary equation, but there are types of fans I often encounter that I believe could fall into two very opposite extremes. One extreme being the toxic fan that I just explored, someone who, for example, makes it their mission in life to ensure that no one ever sees the film or show that they hate ever again and spends hours upon hours of their lives shouting from the rooftops how degraded their franchise has become. But there's another extreme to this that I believe is just as bad, and that is the so-called fanboy or fangirl. That is someone who believes any criticism of their beloved film franchise or show or whatever is unacceptable, and if someone doesn't like something, they should just keep it to themselves because anything negative said about the thing they love is hateful and invalid, and people are not allowed to have or express their opinions at all. Both extremes are bad, and as with most things in life, the truth lies somewhere in the middle. That middle ground is where sanity lies. So, it's that second extreme, the extreme that believes any negative criticism is invalid, that I believe is mostly responsible for perpetuating the myth of fan entitlement. Although they would claim otherwise, when I listen to people's arguments on why some fans feel entitled, all I see are examples of those who have opinions and express their opinions, and that isn't entitlement. Now, I'm not accusing anyone who ever used the term fan entitlement of doing this, but I've heard some try to stifle any negative opinions and openly attack them for trying to say anything negative at all about their beloved franchise. I myself have experienced this as I've made a best and worst list of videos on YouTube after I finished watching a show where I count down my favorite and least favorite episodes. And from time to time, I'll get comments on my worst episode list accusing me of hating the show that I love and stating I'm being disrespectful and hateful by simply stating my opinion. And this kind of behavior I find simply unacceptable. It's people who attempt to stifle and discourage everyone's right to express themselves. And I think this is just as toxic as those who attack others for liking something they hate. Just me personally, and this could be just me, I totally encourage people to express themselves on how they feel on a piece of entertainment. In fact, I spend a lot of my time seeking out these opinions, even if they feel negatively about something I love and think it's great. Especially when it's discussing certain episodes within a TV show franchise or film franchise, because we both love the franchise, even if we disagree on what specific pieces are good or bad within the franchise. For example, many of my favorite YouTube channels, the review channels that I love watching, will often have opinions that I highly disagree with. But that's okay. It doesn't make me enjoy their content any less, as I still appreciate their views and their insights, even if I totally disagree with some of their opinions. And my favorite comments that I get on my channel, the ones that I like more than those who are in complete agreement with the opinion that I state, are the ones that say something to the effect of, I couldn't possibly disagree with you more, but I appreciate hearing your insights and I love watching your channel. There's just something about that kind of open-mindedness and willingness to revel in the many different opinions that exist that I really appreciate. However, as I said, not all who would push the idea of fan entitlement would fall under the banner of this kind of fanboyism. Some reasonable people whom I agree with on a variety of other topics might push this idea, even some of the creatives themselves. So next, I would like to address something a known figure in my personal favorite franchise, Star Trek, has said. Art is a dictatorship. One quote I often heard cited is that from Star Trek 2 and 6 director Nicholas Meyer, who once said, "Art is a dictatorship." In a speech he once gave, he said the following: Art is a dictatorship, government by the consent of the governed. You don't have to watch it, you can turn it off, or you can not buy a ticket. But if you go see a movie I make or read a book I write, then it's mine. You either sign on for the cruise or you don't. With all due respect, I don't care what you think, only because you don't know what you think. If it had been up to you, Spock wouldn't have died. You don't know what you love until you get it. So I don't disagree with the sentiment of what he's expressing, but I do kind of disagree with the wording. To say art is a dictatorship to me is much like someone whose favorite color is green saying green is delicious. It conveys the general idea that green is their favorite color, but using a language that is imprecise, as one does not eat the color green. As calling art a dictatorship seems kind of a misnomer. Art is neither a dictatorship nor a democracy. Art is something creative people create for audiences to enjoy. Also, calling film or television a dictatorship seems kind of wrong, as it is such a collaborative effort among many creatives. And it could be argued that fans do shape what is being made simply by what they choose to consume. However, I do take his point about creatives being the ones solely responsible for creating the art, and the audience can decide either to consume the product or not. And while I find the phrasing, "you don't know what you think," a bit condescending, I again take his meaning. That many audiences who prejudge a show or film before seeing it may think they don't want something until they actually see it and judge it on its own merits. He brings up the specific example of Spock's death in Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan. This is something that Gene Roddenberry was sorely against, but he was overruled. So in an attempt to stop it from happening, Roddenberry leaked this information to the public, and when Star Trek fans heard this, they were outraged. There was a huge outcry not to kill Spock, including many fan petitions and letter-writing campaigns. However, this fan outcry was ignored, and Spock was indeed killed off in Star Trek II, which is now considered the best Star Trek film by the vast majority of Star Trek fans, and one of the best movies of the 80s by general audiences. And Spock's death scene is considered one of the best scenes in all of Star Trek. So in that way, Meyer may seem to have a point, that had he listened to the demands of the fans, they wouldn't have made something that many agree is one of the best on-screen deaths in film history. However, my counter to that would be Spock's resurrection in the following Star Trek film, Star Trek III: The Search for Spock. This is something that Nicholas Meyer was very much against, but the film studio decided to go ahead with it against his wishes. And for that reason, Myers wasn't involved in that film, which was written by Harve Bennett and directed by Leonard Nimoy. And while that film is not held in as high regard as The Wrath of Khan, the choice to bring Spock back to life was something received well by fans, as indeed fans couldn't see how Star Trek could continue without Spock. And although there are other reasons why the studio chose to bring Spock back, a chief one being Leonard Nimoy's renewed interest in the franchise after the success of The Wrath of Khan, what the fans wanted definitely played a role in that decision. Indeed, Leonard Nimoy's Spock would play a crucial role in The Voyage Home, The Final Frontier, The Undiscovered Country, a two-part episode of The Next Generation, and J.J. Abrams' 2009's Star Trek and Star Trek Into Darkness. Many couldn't see how those projects could exist without Leonard Nimoy's Spock. So in one case, they decided to ignore the wishes of the fans and kill off Spock. But in another, they wanted to appease the fans and they chose to resurrect Spock. While some may have opinions on these decisions and some may prefer one over the other, it's safe to say that both decisions were good for the franchise and led to success. So, in conclusion, art is not a dictatorship. Yes, the decisions are ultimately decided by the creators and not the fans, but it doesn't mean that fans' desires are not taken into account. Sometimes they may be disregarded if the creatives feel it's necessary, and other times they may decide to listen to the fans. And either decision could be good or bad for the art in question. It all depends on the circumstance and one's opinion. As even Nicholas Meyer also acknowledged that Star Trek needs its fans, and Star Trek would be nothing without its fans, and in fact, all art dating as far back as Mozart depends on its fans to keep it alive. But films, television, and streaming shows are products intended to make money, and they tend to make more money when people want to see them. Therefore, having a devoted fan base is a huge plus for the business, which is why film and TV franchises are such a big thing now, because studios have noticed that having a devoted fan base is a good thing. And they also learned that it's a good thing to try to please that fan base, otherwise they may lose them. And many critics have noted that the best way to please audiences of franchises is to make good movies or shows that audiences enjoy most of all. That's why franchises like the MCU and Star Trek have succeeded, while franchises like the DC Universe and the Dark Universe failed. Therefore, one would deduce there is a huge incentive for creators to try to please fans to one degree or another. However, there does exist a danger of going too far in trying to appease fans. The dangers of fan service. This is a common opinion that some works try too hard to appease fans and could go as far to appear to be pandering to fans rather than trying to make a good work of art that stands on its own. Such phenomenon is usually referred to as fan service. Fan service is mostly referred to as a bad thing, typically something that diminishes the work, decreases the quality, or distracts from the point of the work in an effort to give fans what they want. Now, sometimes people refer to good fan service, and that is when the work obviously tries to appease the fans, but does it in a way that does not interfere with the quality of the work, and that may in fact increase the quality of the work, despite the fact that it is easily recognized as fan service. Now, what is and is not fan service is subjective, as is whether or not said fan service is good or bad. For one example, I did not care for the fan service in the film Spider-Man No Way Home, as I felt pandered to and that the fan service actively interfered with the quality of the film, particularly referring to them bringing back characters from previous iterations of Spider-Man and having them say familiar lines that they were well known for. However, I was overruled on this one, as the vast majorities of fans loved it, and Spider-Man No Way Home was a resounding success, and many cite as an example of good fan service. And on the flip side, the majority tend to agree that the film Star Trek Into Darkness was bad fan service, as it mirrored the ending of The Wrath of Khan, even quoting lines from that film and bringing back the character of Khan. But again, I disagree with the majority there and feel that it was good fan service, as it did it in the guise of a what-if scenario in a parallel universe, which I thought was taking advantage of the film's premise. However, 3 examples from franchises that I enjoyed that I would particularly point to as succumbing to bad examples of fan service would be Game of Thrones Season 8, Star Wars The Rise of Skywalker, and Star Trek Picard Season 3. Now, many people had a lot of problems with Game of Thrones Season 8, which I'll talk a little more about later. Ironically, though, those who didn't have a problem with Season 8 would accuse those who did of just being upset because their fan theories didn't come true, when in fact, part of the problem was that the show was trying too hard to appeal to fans, particularly when it comes to bringing in an ice dragon that fans have been screaming for years that they wanted to see, bringing back the fan favorite character of Gendry, who arguably didn't add anything to the current story and was just there to hook up with Arya, something fans had been clamoring to see. And worst of all, they pandered to the popular fan theory of Clegane Bowl by having the 2 Clegane brothers, the Hound and the Mountain, fight to the death, even though it distracted from the story and just seemed thrown in there to appease the fans. Star Wars The Rise of Skywalker is a more infamous case of fan service, as they definitely tried too hard to appease the fans after the strong backlash from the very vocal minority of fans who were unhappy with The Last Jedi. In fact, it seemed to try too hard to go in a different direction, to the point that it didn't feel like it was a sequel to the film, and instead seemed more concerned about undoing everything The Last Jedi did that fans were unhappy with. The Last Jedi implied that Rey was a nobody and her parents didn't matter, but The Rise of Skywalker revealed Rey's parents were Palpatines and Emperor Palpatine was her grandfather. The Last Jedi suggested anyone could use the Force and become a Jedi. The Rise of Skywalker highly implied that only those belonging to a certain family or bloodline could become a Jedi. The Last Jedi killed off Snoke when there were all these fan theories on who he was. The Rise of Skywalker revealed Snoke was just a clone being used by Emperor Palpatine to regain control of the galaxy. And for that matter, reintroducing Palpatine, a character who died in universe a long time ago, was definitely a huge transparent attempt to appease the fans. They even had such scenes such as a character randomly giving Chewie a medal because fans had always complained that Chewie never got a medal in Star Wars A New Hope, which many instantly recognized as only being there to try to appease the fans. And ultimately, the film didn't really please the fans, as many of those unhappy with The Last Jedi were still unhappy with this film, and those who did like The Last Jedi also didn't care much for this film, as most recognized it as mostly being fan service attempting to appease the fans rather than trying to tell a good story. And the last example of that I gave is Star Trek Picard Season 3, which was mostly successful as it was received well by critics and fans alike. However, there were many who were either sour or lukewarm on this season, and the main reason that they would cite is fan service. Even those who liked it would admit it was jam-packed, full of fan service. It was just fan service that they liked. And if I tried to name all the fan service in Picard Season 3, I may be here all day. Suffice to say, it was apparent to everyone that trying to appease fans was the chief priority of the show. It should be noted the main showrunner for the show itself, Terry Matalas, was a self-proclaimed fan who grew up on Star Trek The Next Generation, so this may be an example of him not only trying to appease fans, but also himself. The problem is, many of what happened in the show seemed to prioritize this fan service rather than the story. While there was stuff in there that I did like, including some of the fan service, I felt it would have been a much better season had they toned down the fan service and focused more on telling a good story. So, why I bring this up is that many who use the term fan entitlement often bring up examples like these to illustrate the perils of listening to fans, and that fans should be ignored, which I disagree with. I think it's a balance, and the key is to hit the right chord. Try not to alienate your audiences by not paying any attention to what they want, but also don't try too hard to please them, because ultimately what they want is a good story, and that's what creators need to focus on most of all. However, sometimes there are consequences for ignoring fans or producing work that is contrary to what they wanted, which leads me to my next section. Fan petitions are not fan entitlement. A vast majority of videos I watched and articles I read that discussed fan entitlement would bring up online fan petitions to illustrate that a lot of fans are entitled. Now, there are two fan petitions in particular that were focused on a lot, and those are the two that I would like to focus on. The first is the fan petition aimed at HBO asking them to remake Season 8 of Game of Thrones with competent writers. And the other was the fan petition aimed at Disney/Lucasfilm asking them to remake Star Wars Episode VIII, The Last Jedi, with a different director. Both petitions, I believe, got signatures that measured in the millions. Now, these are two that are interesting for me personally. As with Game of Thrones, I totally agree with the sentiment behind this petition, and if I'm not too mistaken, I believe I did sign that petition. However, with The Last Jedi, I disagree with the sentiment, as I like The Last Jedi and would not want to see it remade. So I have two very different feelings on the quality of work in question. However, my conclusion on both petitions are the same, that it is not fan entitlement. Rather, it's fans expressing the opinions to the creatives, something that they have every right to do. Many would cite these petitions as examples of fan entitlement because they argued that it demonstrated the fans feel they have a right to tell the creators what to do, and that they believe they own the property just as much as the studios and creators do, by telling them how to write the story they want rather than what the creators want to do. I even heard one person take issue with the use of the term competent writers in the Game of Thrones petition because it suggests that the writers of Season 8 were not competent, which apparently was crossing some sort of line. Therefore, because they didn't like Game of Thrones Season 8 or The Last Jedi, they felt entitled to get one that they did like. And I'm sorry, but I'm just not following that logic. Let me just throw out the fact that a vast majority of those who signed these petitions never actually expected the studios to remake that work. And in other words, they never felt the petition would actually work. However, they did want to make their opinions heard. And whether or not you agree with their opinions, it's indisputable that they succeeded in being heard. But let's set the point aside for the moment for those who would argue that a majority did think the petition would actually work, something I would disagree with heavily, as I never saw anyone online saying that. But let's set that aside for the sake of argument. Even if some did believe the petition would be successful and that their true goal was to try to get Season 8 or The Last Jedi remade, that still doesn't make them entitled. They're still expressing their distaste with the work to the studio and asking them to remake the work. The key word there is asking, because they know, as everyone knows, that they have no actual control over the work and that it is up to the studio. Now, some may use the word demand rather than ask in order to make them sound more entitled, but I don't believe the word demand applies as it implies that those making the demand have some expectation that the demands must be met, which they clearly do not. As everyone understands, it's in the hands of the studio and not the fans, which is why they need to make the petition to the studios in the first place. If they thought they would have had power over what was made, they would simply exercise that power, but they know that they don't have it. So instead, they have to make a petition asking the studio to do what they want. Therefore, it is just an example of fans expressing their opinions strongly because they feel strongly about it. And it could be argued that these fan petitions had an impact. With The Last Jedi, it was arguably a negative impact. As I mentioned earlier, the follow-up, The Rise of Skywalker, tried too hard to overcompensate to the fan complaints of The Last Jedi and was seen mostly as shameless fan service, even for those who didn't like The Last Jedi. But the fan complaining about The Last Jedi were clearly heard. With Game of Thrones, it's more debatable whether or not fan outcry was heard. However, an argument could be made that it was, as the next Game of Thrones spin-off, The House of the Dragon, was received a lot better than the final season of Game of Thrones. In fact, many were surprised that it turned out as good as it did, as they weren't expecting much after the final season of Game of Thrones. Also, Dan and Dave, the showrunners of Game of Thrones, saw several projects they were involved with, including a Star Wars project and a Netflix project, canceled after the fan backlash against them. Some may argue that the fan backlash had nothing to do with why their projects were canceled, but I would argue otherwise, particularly when it comes to the Star Wars project, as it makes sense that Lucasfilm would be hesitant to hire two creators who were controversial at the time after what they just went through with The Last Jedi. So, an argument could in fact be made that fan backlash or outcry like that could in fact have a positive impact on a film or television properties. Another example I saw given for Fan Entitlement was the incident with Sonic the Hedgehog movie. As what happened was, they released a trailer for the movie and fans expressed their dislike for the CGI design of the title character Sonic the Hedgehog. The backlash on this design was so huge that the studio decided to spend millions of dollars to redesign the character, and then they came up with a design that fans were happy with, and the film ended up being a success and making a lot of money. This incident is noteworthy as things like this usually don't happen in Hollywood, where fans are listened to so directly. So those who proposed the idea of fan entitlement warned that this just encouraged fans to feel entitled, as if they have control over the work, and that was a bad thing. However, I would argue that this is ultimately the studio's decision to do the redesign, and it led to them making a lot of money. It's not much different than the fact that studios will often do test screenings for an early draft of a film for the express purpose of getting audience feedback, and sometimes they may adjust their film accordingly. Several other examples I saw brought up were the Snyder Cut of the Justice League being released and The Expanse being revived after it was canceled due to fan campaigns. I don't think anyone portrayed these incidents as particularly negative, as with the case of Sonic the Hedgehog. It seems like a win-win for everyone. The fans are happy, the studios make a lot of money. However, I believe they were cautioning against such things, as it gives the fans too much power, which would just embolden them to be more entitled and demand for more. For example, with the Snyder Cut, many of the fans who were demanding it didn't stop there once they got it, and instead started demanding that they revive the Snyder DC films. However, if you notice, DC Films did not continue the Snyderverse and instead decided to reboot everything with a new creative in charge. In other words, they decided not to listen to those fans, which to me just proves my point that studios make the ultimate decision on whether or not to listen to the fans based on what they think would make them the most money. And as far as The Expanse goes, I don't see how anyone could see that as a bad thing or as evidence of fans being entitled. Fan campaigns to save canceled shows have been happening for years, back to Quantum Leap or even further back to the original Star Trek series. Both shows were saved by letter writing campaigns. In fact, as many of the videos I've watched pointed out, stuff like this has been happening for a long time, including a fan outcry that convinced Sir Arthur Conan Doyle to revive the Sherlock Holmes novels after adamantly stating that the novels were done. So this would go against the idea of fan entitlement being a new or growing problem. The fact is, studios are in the job to make money. That is their primary goal. And a lot of the time they can make more money by making the fans happy. After all, happy fans are more likely to consume their product en masse than unhappy fans. And while some may claim this could have a negative effect on the quality of the work, it doesn't always. In fact, I would say it usually doesn't, as the product that usually makes the most money is the work that audiences find good. Therefore, it tends to be incentivized to make good quality products as they sell better, and sometimes fan outcry can be helpful to move them in the right direction. Fan entitlement is a myth. So, in conclusion, all the examples I have seen of fan entitlement are simply fans expressing their opinions. Sometimes they do so loudly and in a manner that may annoy those who disagree with them, but they have every right to do so. Sometimes the creators and studios will listen to these opinions, and sometimes they won't. It's really their decision to do so. Therefore, fans never feel entitled to ownership of the work, but they hope to influence those who do own the work. And sometimes they can, since the work in question is a product that the owner hopes to make money off of. And sometimes they can make more money by listening to their consumers. That is, the fans. Now, sometimes this can negatively impact the quality of the work, and other times it can improve it, as studios need to let creatives be creative and create an original piece of art rather than simply catering to fan service. While fan service can sometimes be successful if the piece is still considered to be of quality, but other times it can be seen as pandering and lacking originality. It all really depends on the circumstances. Either way, it is not fan entitlement. It seems to me that those who promote the idea of fan entitlement, and that it is a problem, seem to actually be promoting studio entitlement, whether intentionally or not. Because the message that fans should not make fan petition or letter writing campaigns or constant outcries because to do so is to act entitled seems to be saying that the studios are entitled for you to like their work, or at least for you to stay quiet about it if you don't. I've heard several people state if you don't like something, you don't have to buy it, or you could not watch it or not read it. You don't have the right to dictate how the art is made. To me, this seems to imply that they don't have a right to voice their dislike or distaste for that work. And to me, that does seem entitled on the creator's part. As a creator, you are not entitled for everyone to like your work or to stay quiet about it if they don't. That's just not how the world works, nor should it. If all negative feedback was forbidden, or at least forbidden to be loud and vocal, then positive feedback would become useless. If people were only allowed to give positive feedback, then how would creators or studios know that the positive feedback was genuine? It's more powerful and more meaningful with the negative feedback because it means they aren't just giving you positive feedback just to be nice or out of a sense of obligation. It means that they really mean it. In addition, negative feedback can also be helpful, as it tells creators and studios what they're doing isn't working and that they need to course correct in the future, which would most likely lead to more money for them and a better product for the consumer, as long as they don't overcompensate. So studios that do listen to the fan base are not enabling fan entitlement. Rather, if they choose to listen, it's an attempt to please them, which could lead to more money for them and a better product for the fans. So in other words, win-win for everyone. It is in no way, shape, or form a bad thing. Now, I could see those who have complained about fan entitlement before may accuse me of employing a straw man, of twisting their words, as they never said that people were not entitled to have a voice and to voice their opinions, or that they were saying that negative feedback is a bad thing. And while I do agree that may not be what they meant to imply, I think ultimately that's exactly what they are implying. As the examples of fan petitions and fan campaigns to change a work they're unhappy with are not entitled. It is voicing one's opinions, and studios and creators are free to take that opinion how they will. So to oppose actions such as petitions and fan campaigns or general outcries over something, in my opinion, is to stifle self-expression and to discourage negative feedback. As much as you or I may disagree with said feedback and hope that creatives don't listen to them, it's still every audience member's right to do so. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to leave a like. And if you're a fan of Star Trek, you may consider subscribing to my channel, as I do regular reviews on episodes of Star Trek. At the moment, I'm going through Season 4 of Star Trek The Next Generation. Thank you so much for watching. I hope to see you again.